Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is David Sandalo. I'm the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. We have a tremendous group today to talk about India energy issues. Before we get started, let me just talk about a little bit about the center and what we're doing. We have a speakers program with lots of events. We have upcoming, and by the way, a very robust research agenda. Please go to our website, columbiaenergy.edu. We, under the leadership of our director, Jason Bordoff, who's standing right back here, we've launched quite a series of research notes as well as events. On May 18th, we're going to co-host the second UN Sustainable Energy for All Forum, a session on energy subsidies at the Sheraton Times Square Hotel. In mid-June, we're going to be hosting a session on climate change and China and meeting China's climate goals. For those of you who are watching online, you can submit questions via Twitter. You can tweet it at Columbia U Energy and use the hashtag CGEP events. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to, each of our distinguished speakers is going to talk for 5 minutes or so, and then we're just going to have a conversation. And I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first questions and then bring you all in. I know we have very distinguished people in the audience as well, and we want to engage you. Let me first introduce our speakers. We're particularly delighted to have with us here Mantak Singh Ahluwalia, who's currently the Stern School of Business, New York University distinguished, he's currently there as a distinguished visiting professor. He served, as many people here know, as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India from July 2004 until May 2014. It was a cabinet minister level position, and he's held several other distinguished government positions and has really been a key figure in India's economic planning for more years than he'll admit. Vikram Mehta, and we're delighted to have Vikram Mehta here. He currently serves as the executive chairman of Brookings India. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He started his career with the Indian Administrative Service in 1978, worked for Phillips Petroleum and Shell, along with many other positions, and ultimately serving as chairman of the Shell Group of companies in India. To Vikram's left, we have Richenda van Llewellyn, who is the executive director of the Energy Access Initiative at the UN Foundation, where she works on energy access and the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. She founded and leads UNF's Energy Access Practitioner Network, which you can go to at energyaccess.org. And then to Richenda's left, we have Atul Arya, who's the senior vice president and business leader for Energy Insight Business at IHS, has a long and distinguished background in the energy sector, including work at BP for over 20 years on the oil and gas side as well as on the solar side. So with that, let me just say that the Indian economy is growing robustly. India is the world's largest economy. It has a world's largest democracy. It has a hugely important role in global energy markets, and so we're thrilled by this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Mantak Singh Ahluwalia to make the first comments.
Thanks. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, since you've given us a pretty rigid time limit of 5 minutes, I'll go straight into what I have to say. As you say, the Indian economy is doing quite well. You know, it has its ups and downs, but if you look at the last 12 years or so, including the 2 years including the 2 years before the last one, which we are counting as years of slowdown, the average growth rate is about 7.9%. So my bottom line statement is that the Indian economy has taken off to certainly a 7+% growth, which if we're very lucky and we get all our policies right, could actually be 8%. Even though China is slowing down, I mean, China is slowing down after 30 years of growing at 10%. And I think the Indian economy has been late in picking up momentum, but it has now gained that momentum. So the real thing I want to focus on, I'd be happy to answer questions on what is it that might make that growth continue. By and large, in India, there's a lot of agreement on what needs to be done. And there's also most likely a gradualist approach to policy. Even the new government of whom there were many raised expectations, as they usually are, when the new government came in. I mean, among the first things they did in the economic survey was to say, well, you know, we must make progress gradually. So I think you're going to see progress. It's going to be gradual, maybe a little faster, maybe a little slower. But I think as long as that happens, 7+, maybe up to 8 is feasible. Now, what does that do for energy? I mean, that's really the subject of discussion. You know, in my view, energy is going to be a major constraint for India. I mean, if global, for two reasons. I mean, one is that we're not an energy self-sufficient country. We're pretty highly dependent on imported energy. So if you take all energy in kilograms of oil equivalent, we're about 31% import dependent. And if you look at oil alone, it's sort of well over about 90% or so. So I think it's one of those cases where for India to grow, it certainly needs energy. There's no question about that. And to meet that energy demand, whatever India does domestically is going to be pretty tough without having to do a fair amount of energy importing. And since energy prices are not low, I mean, right now they seem to be low, but I think if you take a longer term horizon, I wouldn't assume that those low oil prices will continue. You've got a problem. And in India's case, you've got, as indeed for any other, if you're concerned also about reducing the carbon footprint, then our big problem is that the one energy resource that we are sort of well endowed with happens to be coal. Now, there are lots of problems about how we can mine coal, and probably we don't do as good a job of it as possible. We can do a better job and so on. But see, the important thing on the energy front is that India cannot expect to continue to have as high a dependence on coal as it does, and still expect to have a reduced carbon footprint. Now, exactly how do we square that circle is the point. You know, before I left the Planning Commission, we had initiated sort of quantitative work on alternative energy scenarios for India. Different kinds of work, but most of all, a sort of energy calculator that allowed you, with a fair amount of detail, to plug in a whole lot of alternative assumptions to see what it is that would make a difference. And you know, the broad picture that came out is that at the moment, if you focus on emissions per capita, GHG emissions per capita, which is after all what everybody's focusing on, that India is probably at the moment around 1.7 tons per capita. And if we carry on a business as usual way, then somewhere around 2030, this 1.7 will actually become 5. And yet we know that from a global point of view, at least by 2020, the world as a whole ought to be aiming at 2 tons per capita. I mean, if it doesn't achieve that, that's not just an India problem. We're still a relatively small part of the global energy basket. It's going to be a huge problem for everybody. So somewhere in the back of our minds, we have to explore what is it that's feasible. Now, in all the analyses that were done, and none of them is ever really conclusive, but if you take them all together, they can be quite persuasive. The bottom line is that there's a huge amount that can be done simply through improved energy efficiency. And we did an analysis which sort of tried to bring down emissions per capita from something like 5.7 down to about 2.7. And about 2/3 of that can happen through energy efficiency. The remaining 1/3 has to happen by shifting the composition of energy supply towards new and renewable energy sources. So the most important thing is that the notion that new and renewable energy sources are going to solve the problem misses the point that the scope for actual energy efficiency taking care of a lot of the problem is underplayed. Now, what is energy efficiency actually supposed to mean? Well, clearly, if you look at it purely from a micro point of view, there's a lot of scope for individual decision making, choosing appliances and machines and technologies and all the rest of it, which are a little bit more energy efficient. And that's quite important. But clearly, in order to incentivize people to do that, you need some combination of setting regulatory standards which become mandatory, and also a supportive price policy. So energy pricing has to play a pretty big role in energy efficiency. And that also plays a very big role in creating the right incentives to produce the energy required. And that's also relevant for the switch to renewable energy, for the simple reason that you'll be able to both produce and absorb renewable energy if conventional energy is properly priced. If conventional energy is subsidized, then it becomes virtually impossible to move to what are available options, and hopefully will become even more available in future. Now, I don't want to get hung up on any particular numbers, but the one big message clearly is energy pricing. We can go into the details, but my overall assessment is, we're lucky that oil prices fell dramatically, and that has enabled us to align petrol and diesel more or less with international prices. But we're not actually, I don't think there's a public appreciation that this has to be part of a system, in the sense that if tomorrow the oil prices were to go up, then the new system should adjust oil prices automatically. Theoretically, that's what's implied. I'm not entirely sure politically that this is well understood. And I think there are problems also with gas pricing, which is actually much below world prices. There are real problems with electricity pricing, in the sense that there's a lot of leakage, which institutionally means that a number of people are actually getting it free, and somehow we're tolerating that. And then, of course, there's agriculture, which actually faces a much lower price for electricity. And the net result of all that is that whoever is running the distribution companies finds it very difficult to absorb higher priced electricity as it comes onto the supply chain. I mean, we are in a position, for example, where on solar energy, we could actually be doing a lot more. We had set up earlier a 20,000 megawatt target. The present government has raised it to 100,000, and that's a good step. I mean, it will require, either it'll require a subsidy or it'll require a very big change in electricity prices over the next 5 or 6 years. Coming back to the issue of supply, I mean, a lot depends on what happens to technology, not only technology in the solar and the wind area, but also in the ability to store electricity. Now, the good news, I mean, I don't know how much of it is to believe, but Tesla and so on claim that they have made major breakthroughs. I think if we do get those kinds of breakthroughs in batteries, then using wind and solar together, we might be in a position to do quite well. So we can go on about this, but I think I noticed that I'm exceeding my time limit, so let me just stop at this point.
That's great. Thank you for teeing up those issues. Let me just ask you one quick follow-up on the macro side. If you had to estimate Indian economic growth over the next 5 years with a 95% confidence interval, what would be the high and low marks, and what do you think will drive the results? What will be the major determinants?
No, that's a really good question, which can only be answered very briefly. I mean, I think when we look at forecasting growth, we're not trying to ascertain a preordained future which we just don't know. It's actually a range of options, and it depends on what policies we follow. My guess is that, assuming that we don't follow exceptionally bad policies, I mean, and that can never be ruled out in real life, the lower level of growth in India would be something like 6% or a little bit less. That is ruling out big-time mistakes. I think in order to get to 8, in my view, 8 is feasible for a while, but it would require a humongous combination of major reforms, all of which are known. But I think what has happened in India is that, we make lists of reforms, and everybody says, yes, that's very good, and we must do that. But when it comes to actually doing it, there are any number of reasons why people say, well, not quite now, it's very difficult, and so on. So basically, between 6 and 8 is, I think, the range. I doubt very much that any government will allow the growth rate to go below 6. there'd be a very strong political backlash from the public. But if they can aim at it and get there, that's wonderful.
Well, thank you. So Vikram Mehta, Mr. Ahluwalia has teed up a number of energy issues. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so thanks, David. Yes, he certainly did summarize the energy problem. And, you know, demand is surging, supply just is not keeping pace with demand, the environment is under stress, and that's really led to us an over-dependence on imports. We import 77% or 80% of our oil. Last year we imported 150 million tons of coal, high calorific value coal, which is equivalent to about 250 million tons. Had the price of oil not come down, we would have spent 10% or more of our foreign, well, 10% of our GDP on importing on imports of energy. So there's a real crisis. Now, I'm not going to repeat the nature of the problem. As Montek has already summarized much of it, but let me try and fast forward it to now, how do we address this problem? All of us know what needs to be done. There have been enough committees set up by the government to address this, and they've all sort of established a fairly clear roadmap. Pricing is one of the consistent themes. We must rationalize prices. It has not been rationalized because of politics. Energy sits at the, sort of the nub of every politician's deepest dilemma, and we know why. And prices just simply have not been addressed. And my big concern is that as and when price of oil, international price of oil starts to move up again, we will return to a price control regime. But as of today, the price of transportation fuel has been aligned to the market. Technology is a big issue. We just have not been able to access state-of-the-art technology. So the productivity of coal, for example, in India is 1/3 per person involved in the coal sector is 1/3 the average productivity around the world. And that is, there are many reasons for it, but one of them certainly is the non-applicability of relevant technology. The recovery rate of oil and gas from our producing fields is 28%. This is against a world average of 40% from similar geologies around the world. The exploration intensity in India is amongst the lowest in the world, 20 wells per 1,000 square kilometers. This is part because of the twists and turns of our policy. There have been too many changes in our fiscal terms. There have been some unnecessary or overly intrusive responses by the government. That has disincentivized investment. So we have a problem of pricing, we have the problem of technology, we've had an issue of bureaucratic interference. We also have an issue concerning data. The data that we have right now is antiquated. We just have not done enough survey of the resource space or the energy resource space in the country, and that needs to be addressed. And finally, a real issue is institution. As Montek knows only too well, until fairly recently, we had too many government ministries involved with the energy sector, and all of them were working in different compartments within their own silos, focused on protecting their own turf. So there was a minister for petroleum, there was a minister for coal, there was a cabinet minister responsible for renewables, Montek was responsible for planning. He actually had responsibility to try and draft up an integrated energy policy, which he did, but even he will agree that the executive bodies responsible for implementing that policy were in the ministry, and they were not necessarily aligned. So there's an institutional issue. Now, if I just move to what has this government done then to address these issues? The record is mixed. I mean, it's only a year since this government has been in power, and perhaps it would be premature to try and do a post-mortem on this government with, on a subject that has such long lead times. But in this 1 year, they have certainly taken the right step with regard to renewable energy and coal. The targets that they've set for renewable, that is solar and wind, are unrealistic. They've jacked up the target for solar energy from 2.5 gigawatts to to 20, which was the target set by Montague's government, to 100 gigawatts by 2022. And for wind, they've jacked up the target from 25 gigawatts to 50 gigawatts, I think, 60 gigawatts, also within the same period. Now, this is totally unrealistic for three reasons. One is that it will really require massive project management skills. You know, the average addition of renewable energy in the country over the last few years has been 1 to 1.5 gigawatts. What we're looking for now, or what the government is looking for, is to add 6 gigawatts per annum of wind and 19 gigawatts per annum of solar. The second problem with this is that the grid is just too weak to absorb the influx of, you know, of this massive influx of intermittent and variable electrons. And the third problem, of course, is finance. $100 billion of plus will be required to create this level of renewable energy. But I am pleased with the fact that they've actually set their target on a clean energy agenda. So that's a positive. The second positive is that they've unclogged the problems with the coal industry. So the coal sector had been completely strangulated because of a number of reasons, and we can go into it. They've introduced now a coal mine, a new bill, and for the first time, coal production is starting to see an uptick. In the first month of this quarter, this fiscal year, coal production increased by 10%. That's a positive. We've still got a long way to go, but it's a positive. What this government has not done is to actually energize the oil sector. There's been really nothing done on the oil sector, and we really need to ask ourselves this question: what is going to happen? So let me just stop here and say that if you're looking forward, the energy crisis, the energy problem of demand, supply, and environment remains a serious problem. This government seems to be alert to the fact that they have to start to bridge the gap, or else they're going to face not just financial issues, but vulnerability. They'll be vulnerable to the geopolitics of energy. We still import 60% of our crude oil from the Middle East. And with the Yemen and the Straits of Hormuz sort of in turmoil, we're going to have to really ask ourselves, how do we ensure maritime security for supplies? But this is a government that has a prime minister that seems to understand the energy business. And I'm, on balance, positively inclined because of the steps that they've taken. Let me just end here because I've already exceeded my...
So much to follow up on. Thank you. Let me just pick quickly two items. The first, when talking about coal, you said that coal in India is 1/3 as productive as globally. Can you just explain what you mean, what efficiency parameter, and then I just...
That was coal mines, the productivity of an individual working in the coal sector.
I see.
So it's 4.92 tons per capita as against 12 point something per capita world average. Our own target, the coal industry's own target, Coal India's target is 5.7 tons per person involved in the coal sector. And so they're actually even lower than the target that they had set for themselves.
And then on oil and gas, you made a number of statements about the potential for oil and gas if this were done right and done at world standards. Could you just elaborate on that? I mean, is there a scenario in which India is significantly reducing its import dependence as a result of improvements in the oil and gas sector, or not?
Well, there are three things that we could do in the short term, and a lot that we could do in the medium to longer term. Certainly, the first thing is that, as I mentioned, the recovery rate from our producing fields is 28%. That means for every 100 molecules that are actually discovered, we are only getting 28 out of the ground. The average recovery rate for blocks of similar geology, this is the important, similar geology, is 40. So the application of not state-of-the-art, off-the-shelf technology would actually raise our productivity by, for the sake of argument, 12%, from 28 to 40. So that's one. The second is that data. We just have not done enough work on evaluating our resource space. So the seismic data, the geophysical data that we have in our data centers is antiquated. That gives the oil companies, both domestic and international, less of a handle to peg their investment decisions. This can be easily and very quickly rectified. We can quickly actually carry out a full-fledged geophysical survey of our 26 sedimentary basins. And the third thing, which is really, I mean, it's an avoidable problem, and that is our regulators in the Ministry of Petroleum have decided that they know better than the oil companies on how to manage the fields. And they therefore do not allow the oil companies that have, whether it's the government oil companies or the private oil companies, to the autonomy to run their operations freely and without oversight. And that actually is a cost, a huge cost, because each of the development plans, the drilling plans, get delayed, without any reason. And this delay is a disincentive, but it's also very costly.
Thank you. So, Richenda, you've done extensive and very important work in India for many years. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And you're probably wondering why an American woman with a Dutch last name and a British accent can talk about India, but that is the world that we live in. And I lead, as David had said in his kind introduction, the Work on Energy Access at the United Nations Foundation within the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. So I want to just frame my remarks about a very different aspect of some of the energy challenges that have been faced in India, particularly from my world, which is really looking at the relationship between sustainable development outcomes and energy, in particular access to electricity, which for those of you who follow this at all, you will know that about a sixth of the world still does not have the development benefits that come from having access to electricity. And in India, that's still about 300 million people. India's made an awful lot of progress in terms of electrification of its villages, going from something like 572,000 to villages out of the 590,000. But electrification of a village does not, under that definition, actually mean that everybody in that village has access to electricity. So that's both been a negative, it's been a terrific challenge, and there is work underway, particularly to accelerate the rate of grid electrification within India. But it's also been an opportunity, and I have the privilege of working with a lot of innovative companies, including one well known to many in India called Selco, which has been around for 20 years, delivering small-scale decentralized energy solutions really to help people get onto the first rung of the energy ladder. So there we see already that, in fact, renewable energy solutions are not the most expensive option. Often they're the most affordable and sustainable option for providing an alternative to using kerosene in lighting or using very rudimentary forms of lighting to help that family or that community really begin to enhance their own livelihoods. Again, many of you will know that the benefits that we see from having electricity can involve environmental benefits, of course, but also health benefits in terms of not having to take in the emissions and the fumes from smoke from kerosene and also from rudimentary cook stoves. We can come to cooking later as well. But we're also seeing very much that energy is inextricably intertwined with livelihoods. So we do see that even small amounts of electricity can help to improve the livelihood for whether it's a farmer, whether it's a woman entrepreneur, or a home-based business, to be able to even keep lights on later in the evening does in fact inherently have an effect on improving income. With Selco that I mentioned, in fact, they've studied over the last 20 years of their work with these off-grid populations that, in fact, income increases on a household basis by about 10 to 15% for that family, just as a result of having a very small-scale lighting system, usually with a small-scale solar panel and a couple of lights within the house. So apart from the macro-level energy issues that we see in the Indian context, I think to frame my remarks, I really also want to talk about the dynamism and the innovation that's there at the household level, at the community level, in terms of being able to bring access to energy for those communities that still don't have even basic electricity. And that's not counter to the grid extension. I think that's actually very highly complementary to the grid extension, and where it sort of meets in the middle as well. We're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of focus on microgrids, which are small utilities, often community-run or run by an entrepreneur in a community. And particularly, we're seeing a number of different efforts in India right now to tie that into the IT sector, and particularly looking at if you are bringing renewable energy solutions to a cell phone base station, can that either be leveraged or built out into community applications as well? So there's a lot of companies that are looking at this. There's a number of initiatives that are underway. And we are also seeing that despite this innovation, there are a number of different barriers that remain within the sector. Some of them are policy barriers in terms of where there's needing to be a sort of a tweak within the National Solar Mission for ensuring that the incentives do actually flow to the businesses. I think sometimes we see that there's a heavy focus on installation and not on long-term maintenance of these solutions. So you have a 20-year life of the solution. You need to have a plan for being able to support the maintenance, particularly when you're working in very low-income or remote areas as well with those communities that cannot afford to pay twice for that solution. So we are seeing a shift. We're seeing innovation. We're seeing a lot of new businesses, not only actually working in the Indian context, but we're also seeing a tremendous amount of South-South engagement where Indian entrepreneurs are also working with partnerships across sub-Saharan Africa as well, where we see a lot of need for energy access solutions as well. Particularly in solar PV, I would say that's where we're seeing the most engagement and innovation, but it's not by any means restricted to solar. We're seeing a lot of hydro, small hydro solutions, and also within the Indian context particularly, they've been looking at biomass powering energy and electrification as well, particularly looking at rice husk for powering biomass-based solutions as well. So I will stop there, but just to say that this is something where we see a lot of innovation coming into the sector. We see, and I was very glad to hear the energy efficiency piece mentioned alongside energy issues earlier on, because we also see that very much that energy efficiency can help with driving the energy access as well, whether we're looking at appliance efficiency, but particularly when you have a constrained environment, when you only have a certain number of watts going into that household, you want to be able to use that most efficiently. So we see work that still needs to be done to help with ensuring that the appliances that are available to those communities and for those applications are also as efficient as they can be. And I'm sure that's music to your ears, David, having come from the US DOE before.
Thank you, Ratenda. Could you just say a word about the financing of energy access in India? I mean, you mentioned all these different technology approaches, but Lhasa's population presumably lacks the purchasing power. What are the ways in which financing can scale up to address these needs?
So there's many different angles to that. There's the public sector piece of it, certainly, and there have been there's been a lot of work underway on the National Solar Mission to help prime the pump. Literally, there's a focus now on irrigation pumps and helping them to move from diesel to solar. There's priority lending sectors that do look at energy access. There's also, one of the benefits in India in this sector is that there's a very, very well-developed infrastructure around agricultural banks that are in most of the areas that we see are contiguous with the need for bringing electricity. And so there are mechanisms by which the agricultural banks can lend into this sector with preferential rates. Not all of the businesses are necessarily well attuned to take benefit of that. So we also see some of the microfinance institutions are also lending, although they tend to be somewhat leery of asset-based financing. But if I was channeling my inner Harish Hande, the founder of Selco India, then I would say one of the key bases for being able to bring these small-scale energy solutions to very low-income households is looking at the cash flow of the household and then pricing what they pay, whether it's on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, or seasonally if they're only getting a couple of harvests per year, and then structuring the price of that solution set to match the household cash flow as well.
Thank you. So, Atul, you have a challenging assignment following three such distinguished and expert speakers, but I've known Atul for many years. I know you know a lot about a lot of things. So you could take this whatever direction you like, and Atul Ari, as I said before, runs energy research at IHS.
Thank you, David, and great to be here. Yeah, I think that the subject has been covered very well, but I'm just going to maybe dwell on a few points which have already been made and emphasize them. And really, three main thrusts here. One is the issue around public-private partnership, which Vikram touched on. Really important for the government and the private sector to work much better together than I think they have done so, particularly in the oil and gas sector, but more broadly, more opportunities for that. Second, notwithstanding what Mr. Ahluwalia said around policy, there's still a lot of policy clarity needed, and the policy roadmap needs to be clear. So I'll touch on that briefly. And the third point is around capacity building. Given India's sort of demographic dividend, it's become as a surprise that there aren't enough experts on oil and gas in particular, but there's a big need for capacity building, particularly in the public sector. Given the salaries and the compensation is not as high as in private sector, real important need for that. And sort of a half point, which I'll leave for discussion, is around the importance of gas and how gas could be a bridge to a lower carbon economy, given its important role. And it's such a small portion of India's energy mix today is gas, only about 6%. And actually, in the last few years, it has gone down, not gone up, which is a pretty big problem. Let me give you two very quick examples of where, what India has done and where the opportunity lies. Just on oil and gas, to give you some data, only 25% of discoveries made in India in the last 15 years have come online. The global average is actually 40%. If you take LNG out, which takes a bit longer, it's more like 50%. So half as fast. These are discoveries already known, and one of the reasons is the policy and the terms are not very clear. India is drilling around 47 exploration wells on the average every year. The global average is 84 exploration wells per year, almost double of what India is doing. India's exploration, sedimentary basins, more than 75% have been marginally explored, which I think Vikram touched on. 50% of basins have yet to be explored at all. So big opportunity given the deficiency in oil particularly, and gas as well, but not much has happened in the last few years. And some of the policy challenges related to oil and gas, one is around PSC contracts. They have changed, continue to change. So having the sanctity of contracts is really important in our own ranking. We rank every country in terms of exploration, attractiveness. I forgot to check, but the last time I checked, India was below 50. So there are 50 places above India where a private company can go in and explore. They would prefer to do that before going to India, which is a big problem given the competition for capital and talent. So it's a very big opportunity which is being missed because of lack of clarity around policy capacity building. Another issue which some companies are currently facing, going back to the point around EOR, which Vikram, you made, some of the companies don't have, the contract extensions haven't been agreed. So nobody is going to invest money where, for example, EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery, barrels are going to flow 10, 15 years into the future, but the contract is ending in the next 5 years. So why would they invest money until that clarity is there in terms of extension of contracts? Another big issue. And it's going to become a bigger issue as more and more fields come for renewal. Natural gas, I think it's an interesting history. We can talk about it forever as to what has happened on natural gas pricing. Number of changes in pricing. The price was set, then it went to the courts for decision. They came up with a decision, then the new government has made a different decision on gas pricing. And really, unless somewhere in the future, we will have to get to a more market-based pricing for gas to really encourage both gas imports and also domestic exploration for gas, whether it is unconventional gas or conventional gas, which there is significant potential and could also help on the path to lower carbon energy mix. So I think these are some interesting challenges just on the oil and gas sector. Now coming to power, which is a big challenge and big focus for the current government, 24/7 electricity. This is the big focus. I was in India in March and had the opportunity to meet the oil and gas minister and the power minister, both of them, and they both talked about 24/7 electricity, which is kind of interesting. There's an initiative, 100 smart cities. You heard about the 100 gigawatt of solar by 2020. Another initiative on 15,000 kilometers of new gas pipelines. So lots of initiatives, but still, coherence is needed around the overall policy. So on the power sector, from 2007 to 12, coal-fired generating capacity went up by almost 10%, which is good news, actually. Big growth in power generation. But actually, coal production went up only by 5%. So you have all this capacity, but it's not being used for generation because lack of coal available. And the sort of the perverse impact of this is a lot of diesel generation capacity being put in place because captive generation is much more reliable, although expensive, but more reliable. There is about 90 gigawatt of diesel generating capacity today in India, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. That's probably highest diesel generating capacity anywhere in the world. The cost of generating by diesel is about 2.5 to 3 times what it is from a regular, grid power. So it's a complete, economically it makes no sense. But people do it because it's reliable and it's something you can turn on every time there is, load shedding or a cut in power supply. So a number of big challenges on the power sector. I think, we heard about the pricing challenge, which is a big challenge for across the sector, having market-based pricing. And I think one of the other things we should talk about and think about is where is the subsidy? We know subsidy is needed. So where does the subsidy apply? Is to the producer, to the consumer. There has been very mixed subsidy regime. And what the government did around diesel was a very good move to eliminate the subsidy so that it's more market-based. Ultimately, the price will go up when the global oil price goes up. But that's a good move. And can we change that? There is a new scheme on LPG, so there is a request appealed by the government, by the Prime Minister, that those people who can afford to pay for LPG, they voluntarily not take the subsidy and give up the subsidy, which is a good scheme. But I think we need more subsidy reform pretty quickly, because ultimately that is what is going to be needed to get investment in place. Ultimately prices need to go up so the investment can come in, and investment will allow for more energy in India. It's so deficient in energy. Pretty much every metric you look at from a sort of big developing country with say 6 to 8% GDP growth, it falls into pretty much in the lowest quartile of energy consumption, energy generation. Just so happened, personal story, I was in India in March, and I went from India to China, to Beijing. I met the Central Electricity Authority in Delhi, and I went to the State Grid office, kind of the equivalent group in Beijing. If you just look at the offices of the two entities, it's like you are living in a different planet. State Grid, which controls the electricity sector in the entire country, in Central Electricity Authority in India, we had to go around the office to find the person we were trying to meet. It took us half an hour. We went to the State Grid. If anybody's been to the State Grid office in Beijing, it's the 21st century, LEED 6, LEED 5 category building with everything working, perfectly. So I think that's kind of contrast we have. So we're not here to compare India versus China, but I think there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of things both the public sector and the private sector can do to improve the situation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Atul, you have had some background in the solar industry, and Vikram has some pretty strong comments about the renewables targets being unachievable, I think, if I'm quoting you correctly.
Yeah.
From your background in the solar sector, would you agree with that?
I think the 100 megawatt is pretty long shot, I would say. So one thing I did strike me is that there is the amount of discussion around renewables, solar and wind, is at a much higher level in terms of, if you just took the stories in the newspapers and the conversations in the government, I think it's disproportionately higher than in the oil and gas. So, in my view, India is like, India will need everything. It's all up above energy policy. All kind of fuels will be needed. But there seems to be a lot more discussion around renewables than on oil and gas. This is not to shoot down the renewables. I think solar, personally, I think has a huge potential in India, very large potential. But right now, based on the data we have, the total installed capacity is less than 5 gigawatts of solar, right? So I think more like 3 to 4 gigawatts. To get to 100 gigawatts of new solar in next 8 years, that's pretty ambitious. I think we could say it's going to be very challenging. I think ultimately the issue will be twofold. One is financing, which you touched on. Other is going to be just the grid can the grid absorb all of that solar. Not all of it is going to be distributed solar. A lot of it is going to be big solar plants. The grid is not ready. Grid cannot absorb even the current capacity we have. So how will the grid absorb the new capacity of solar, which is going to be more difficult to connect than, say, a coal-fired plant will be.
Mantik or Riten, do you have thoughts on that topic, or you want
No, I mean, I think what Vikram said is that, this 100 gigawatts was more a sort of a political announcement signaling that solar is very important. Now, mind you, I've been in New York since the 1st of February. I have no idea what's actually going on. But, my guess is that it's certainly not funded. Because we know that with present technology, the cost of solar, particularly if you include the balancing costs needed in order to make it a relatively even supply for the grid, is much higher than the cost of the marginal cost or the cost of the marginal available supply from conventional electricity. And the present position is that the distribution companies are actually quite unwilling to absorb even the available conventional stuff at the marginal cost, simply because they're not able to raise the tariff. So there's a huge issue there. And it all boils down to the pricing. I mean, that's what I started off with. I mean, whether it's, look, Indian coal is underpriced. Indian gas is being underpriced. I think the previous government had appointed a committee which had recommended a certain price. There's a huge political perception in India that somehow this is favoring whoever is producing it. So there was further discussion. I think the new government put forward a new formula which somewhat lowers the price. So that's underpriced. Petrol and diesel at the moment are aligned with global prices. But these are public sector run organizations. So if tomorrow, although it is said that we have decontrolled, if tomorrow the price of oil were to shoot up, none of these guys will actually raise the price without checking. We don't actually have a government decision which makes it mandatory to adjust the price according to a predetermined, cabinet-determined formula. So what I think is fair to say is that a gradual process of adjustment was going on under the previous government. Oil prices collapsed, and they came to where the price had been brought. And so we've said, now it's deregulated. But, it could change, basically. And I think solar is actually, at the moment, absorbed in the grid by a slightly complex system of cross-subsidization. Because there is a purchasing company which the central government has set up, which takes the available conventional power which is available for the central government, pools it with solar power, and then sells that to the states. Now that the potential for pooling has disappeared because all the available power is used up. So now either solar prices will collapse, which they hopefully will in due course, or, I mean, this 100 gigawatts is extremely difficult to reach. And we don't have a declared policy with sufficient clarity that would persuade a huge lot of private investors to set up the 100 gigawatts. I mean, you'd need much greater clarity before that would happen.
There was brief mention of air pollution issues, but only brief. I wanted to ask about that because it's gotten a lot of international attention in the last little while, particularly the air pollution issues in Delhi. To what extent are environmental policy and energy policy connected in India today, and do you see the environmental constraints being a material factor in energy development over the course of the next few years?
Well, I think that's okay.
No, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right that the air pollution, that's a genuine case where the public at large has become aware how bad it is, and there's a huge amount of pressure now to do something about it. I think the only change so far is that there will now be an official air quality index, which the government will put out. I mean, earlier, the air quality indices were based on more like non-governmental measuring. So one good thing is that the governments recognize it's important, and there will be official air quality indices. And I think people need to hold the chief minister. This is not something the central government can do. But you know, there's a lot that the central government can do. It all relates to fuel pricing. For example, I mean, take you know, the Euro 4, 5, 6 standards, which we call the Bharat 4, 5, 6 standards, right? And clearly the quality of fuel you use is going to affect, in some sense, the degree of pollution. Now, the government could leapfrog and say, look, we're going to go straight to Bharat 6. To do that, the refineries have to put in a lot of money, and they have to recover that money, which means the oil price to the consumer must go up. So I think those are the difficult. If you take a vote, should we clean up air quality, you would immediately get unanimity in the whole city. But when you say, and therefore shall we do A and B and C, people say, well, hang on a minute, I didn't say that. And I think we need people to be aware of this.
Richenda, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, just on a more micro level, I mean, there's an initiative underway that's also very closely working with the government of India on household level emissions and air quality at the household level as well. So switching out from the sort of the more traditional rudimentary biomass-based cooking solutions to helping people. Somebody mentioned LPG. You know, if they can, LPG is aspirational, but not everybody can afford to cook using LPG. So really trying to look at the better quality technologies and fuels, making them affordable for very low-income households, but doing that at scale to help really looking at some of these local level, household level air pollution issues, which are not only indoor but also relate to outdoor air pollution, and particularly looking at the black carbon piece of this as well. So there's a lot of focus right now through our sister initiative called the Global Alliance of Clean Cook Stoves that's working together with the government of India, really looking at this, looking at what are the right technologies that can bring not only these indoor air pollution emissions down, but also can have health benefits for the families. So you get a sort of a win-win, which is not only local air improvement, but also better health, because you reduce things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pneumonia, and other issues that actually equate to early mortality for a lot of people.
I don't think anybody mentioned nuclear either, and I know nuclear power was certainly at the top of the agenda when our president met with Prime Minister Modi. Does anyone on the panel have thoughts on nuclear power or familiarity with the situation?
I can very briefly mention, David, that India currently has about 5 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. The goal is to double it in the next 5 years, which a lot of construction is currently taking place. So I think nuclear will remain a very important part of the power mix, but it's not, coal will remain the dominant fuel for power for foreseeable future. Nuclear clearly has a very important role. That's all I would say. And one other thing which is quite interesting is this, the new technology, particularly the modular technologies, which are being developed outside of India mostly. They could have a very interesting place in India because easier to perhaps install those. But that's another 10 plus years further down the road, really. Nothing immediate.
We have a question that's come in from Twitter, and in a few minutes we're going to go to the audience as well. But from Twitter we have the question, will India follow China and the United States lead in coal to natural gas switching? What may prevent it? Any thoughts on
Coal to what?
Coal to natural gas switching. So will there be coal to natural gas switching in India? We've talked about that some, but any further thoughts on that?
Well, I think the intent certainly would be to accelerate the usage of natural gas. The problem is twofold. One is that the infrastructure for bringing gas to the consumer is inadequate. So we have 2 pipelines today that cross different states, one from South India, or well, East India, sorry, yeah, East India to West India, and one from West India to North India. But there is no pipeline that actually connects all the consumers. There's no national gas pipeline. So that in itself is a major constraint. The second is pricing, which we've talked about. The pricing structure for natural gas is actually disincentivizing exploration of natural gas. And it also, in some senses, disincentivizes the import of LNG, because ultimately, not at today's price, but let's say a year back, LNG was just not affordable for the anchor customers of gas, power, or fertilizers, because they were subsidized, their consumers were subsidized. There's a third problem, which is the taxation structure. The taxation structure in the country is such that, you know, you go from one state to another and there's a different tax. So unless and until petroleum is included within the ambit of what's called the General Services Tax regime, which is currently passed the lower house of Parliament, which is going to be tabled in the upper house, I guess, within days. But petroleum is not part of that GST structure right now. But unless and until it is, we're still going to have these very sort of anomalous, complex tax structure, which is also going to, which will inhibit this transformation from gas to coal. So the answer is the intent is there. The likelihood of that intent translating into reality is limited by these three factors. And I guess you've got to recognize that coal is, we do sit on the 5th largest reserves of coal in the world. The government of India has announced its intent to treble coal production from 500 million tons right now to 1.5 billion tons within 5 years. Now, again, it's an unrealistic target in my view, but even if you get to a doubling of coal production, you're increasing the share of coal in the total energy basket, and that's going to come at the expense of oil and gas. So the answer is no. I don't see the transformation happening in the way that China has managed it.
David, can I add a couple of quick points to what Vikram said? One is that it's not quite correct to say that China is following the US path. I mean, China's overall gas mix is very low. I think it's 8%, if my memory serves me, 8 or 9%. So
I think it's even less.
Yeah. So it's very low. It's really the US, which is driven by shale gas production, at much lower cost. Ultimately, cost is the king. So gas cost here is much lower than coal cost, which has made a big difference. I think the other issue, besides what Vikram said, I completely agree with everything Vikram said around gas. One other issue with India is that India does have a lot of unconventional resource, and particularly coal bed methane, a lot of that. But the quality of that resource is much poorer. So even with all the goodwill and all the technology and everything else and regulation and taxation, still India is not going to become another US in terms of unconventional gas production. Clearly, given where it is, it can, even if it double or triple the gas mix in power, it'll be a big change. But I think it's going to take a long time to get to that point.
Thank you, Vikram Mehta.
No, I was just going to, you just triggered a thought very quickly on the unconventionals. You know, we talk about the potential for unconventionals, but of course, in our country, the above ground factors are far more, in some senses, a limiting factor than the below ground resources. So, we don't have the water, we have problems of land acquisition. The owners of land don't have access or don't have claims to resources under the land, unlike in America, where if you find anything under your sort of ownership, under your real estate, you actually have access to it. So there are lots and lots of, and then there are the center state issues. I mean, one of the things that Montague just referred to is it's a state subject. Energy is a concurrent subject that is handled both by the central government and the state government. And we have 28 different state governments. Everyone has its own sort of view on how they're going to manage the state energy systems. And so we can talk about the potential of unconventionals, but I have some doubts as to whether that'll be realized in the near future.
Thank you very much. For those who are listening by podcast, my name is David Sandalo. We're here at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy session on the future of Indian energy. I'm here with Montek Ahluwalia, Vikram Mehta, Richenda Van Llewellyn, and Atul Arya. And I would like to invite anyone from the audience who has questions to please come up to the microphone. Please identify yourself.
My name is Charles Frank. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. I'd like to hear a little bit more about coal, because coal is the most important energy resource in terms of local availability. I have a few questions. One, is transport a major limiting factor in use of domestic coal, or is the low calorie content a much more important factor which generates more imports because imports have been growing over time? Secondly, is there any opportunity for retrofitting or building coal plants that use supercritical technology, which are much more efficient than, right now, India has some of the lowest efficiency among their coal plants? And the third question is, and this is a little bit of an outlier, is there any scope for integrated coal gasification combined cycle, or is that just too futuristic and too expensive?
Vikram.
Yeah, well, the transport has been a limiting factor as far as coal production is concerned. The railways have not been able to meet the, well, let's say to bring the production from the pit head to the consumer. And that's, it's not so much the real problem has been the absence of feeder railway tracks from the coal mine to the main tracks. The feeders have been, there has not been sufficient investment there. So it's actually been a big issue. So, I think a problem that I referred to earlier was the institutional fragmentation of decision making, and this is an example of that, where you have the Ministry of Coal, the Ministry of Railways, the Ministry of Environment, all of them sort of working within their own silos, and there's been an absence of an integrated plan. So I think transport has been a factor. The much more so than the quality of coal. Another problem with coal is that we just simply have not actually focused on underground coal mining. The bulk of our resources are underground. Most of our mining is open cast. And that is part because we haven't actually, because of costs, because of organizational issues, because of technology. But until and unless we actually go deeper, we're not going to be able to improve the productivity of coal. Today we import, as I said, 150 million tons of coal, of high calorific value coal, which is equivalent to 250 million tons of our coal. So our total consumption of coal in the country is about 800 million tons. We produce 500. So we are importing effectively about 300 million tons, although, you know, in absolute terms, it's only 150, 165 million tons that we import. The ash content is poor. We haven't invested enough in washeries. So there's a huge problem with the whole coal sector, and it's been a problem that's been compounded by the absence of investment in that sector, and of course the corruption in that sector, which brought the whole industry to a standstill over the last three years. With regard to the ultra-critical turbines, you're absolutely right. I mean, most of our power plants are actually running on inefficient turbines, and there is now 65% of our power plants, in fact. But the government is well aware of this, and there's, I think, now a determined effort to move towards super efficient, ultra-critical sort of turbines. So there's that. I think on that score, there's a sort of a positive that we can certainly look to a major change. And here again, part of the reason I would say is an institutional reason. Today, there's one minister who's responsible for coal, power, and renewables, whereas a year ago there were 3 different cabinet ministers. So there's now one minister responsible. So to some extent, the institutions are there's better coordination at the institutional, at the bureaucratic and political level. We have the technology of integrated combined cycle, and we have actually even experimented with it. But a problem with application of that technology goes actually to the root of the problems of the energy sector, which is how do you get the central government and the state government to work together, to apply technologies? How do you get different entities? Because integrated combined cycle technology will require the Ministry of Petroleum and the Ministry of Coal at the central government level, will require the state government also to get involved, and we'll have all these entities must be working together. And when I was with Shell, for instance, we sought to apply this technology, but we didn't get beyond first base because of this inability to bring everyone together onto the same page. Everyone recognized the importance of it, and they individually gave credit to companies that have the technology, but the actual implementation fell foul of this institutional constraint that I've been sort of harping on over the, So I don't know
Thank
whether
you.
you agree
Next
with that.
question.
Actually, I've got a follow-on question. My name is Nat Cohan. I'm with Environmental Defense Fund. And the question is a follow-on one. We were talking earlier about the renewable targets and the difficulty of perhaps meeting the renewable targets or the solar targets that the government has made. And I'm curious about, and I think Rahul mentioned this in passing, how likely is it that the coal targets would be met, given the institutional issues, the transport issues, some of the issues of water and so on? And I'm curious about how do we think about the future of coal in India and how rapidly it's likely to grow given these institutional constraints and these other constraints? Because if we had other people up here who had read IEA or whatever, they would say, oh my gosh, the production of coal is going to quadruple and quintuple, and I'm curious about your perspectives on it.
Well, Coal India accounts for 90% of our coal production, and the balance is private companies. According to the Ministry of Coal, the problem is not going to be, the private sector actually produces 40 million tons. Of the 494 million tons, private sector only produces 40. The government's intent is to get the private sector to move from 40 to 500 million tons. And the public sector, Coal India, to move from 500 million tons or 450 million tons to 1 billion tons. And that's how they intend to meet their 1.5 billion ton target. If you were to talk to the government of India, they will say that the problem is not going to be with the private sector. It's going to be with the public sector. It's going to be with Coal India. And the Coal India problems are going to have all to do with the legacy issues that they've inherited, which are organizational, labor, technology, as I said, center state, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But we are going to solve it. That's what the Modi sort of refrain is right now. We will solve it. Now, you ask me how likely is it? Our track record of solving problems of that nature in our country is not good. So the likelihood of actually getting the public sector in India to double its productivity within a 5-year time span, because they've actually set themselves a 5-year target, is low. But, and then if you say, is it likely that the private sector will indeed be able to deliver? I'm not sure, because I don't know if the private sector has the money. I don't think the private sector has the competence even, or the technology. They have actually acquired leases, but the companies that have acquired leases are not companies that have a long experience in mining coal. So the short answer to your question is, no, I'm not going to put my bet on the government of India even doubling its coal production in 5 years' time, let alone tripling it. But
I think there is only one other thing to add is another factor is that globally, China's coal demand is actually plateauing and probably may decline actually. And what that would mean, and if you look at the US, our coal demand is also declining because of gas substitution. So interestingly, there will be more coal available for India to import, probably at a lower price. So there will be another interesting dimension to look at as to, is it really worthwhile doing everything what Vikram is saying rather than just importing it, which is simpler and probably as competitive cost-wise.
Just to comment on this, I think even the scenario that Vikram is talking about is a very significant increase in coal production in China, or excuse me, in India. And we've pretty pessimistic forecasts here about solar and other renewables. That sounds like a pretty pessimistic forecast when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions coming from India. How do we think about India's role in solving climate change issues going forward?
You're asking me?
Sure.
No,
it's a nice, easy question for you.
No, I think, as I said right at the beginning, I think energy requires a great deal of careful thought, work, integration of all these different things that hang together. And the truth is, the government's only just come in, and most of these targets that are announced are not actually, as I think, are not the result of a careful consideration of what is likely, whether the target is appropriately funded or not. I was told that the successor to the Planning Commission, that's the Niti Aayog, under the dynamic leadership of Columbia University, was going to produce a sort of a midterm appraisal of the 12th plan. I mean, the last official sets of targets were 12th plan targets. Historically, we've never actually achieved plan targets, but if we get reasonably close to that, we feel that's good enough. Targets are meant to be ambitious. Many of the targets that have now been announced are much beyond the 12th plan targets. So actually to get a sense of whether this is feasible, I think the new Niti Aayog should sort of prepare a document which says, look, taking into account the resource constraints and all the multiple objectives, this is what India can do. Now, some of this trebling of coal, I don't think is necessary at all to treble coal production in 10 years in order to grow at 7.5% or something like that.
You don't think that? You don't think it's necessary?
No. Look, it's energy efficiency that matters. And I mean, that's not easy, because I want to make this clear. In all the work that we've done, see, energy efficiency is not just a microeconomic, if it was a pure microeconomic decision, where all the technology is available, then you just jack up the energy price, and any sensible consumer will choose the right thing. But in many of these cases, it is introducing systems that are going to be more energy efficient. And those systems require a very considered government effort. I mean, take the simplest thing. We've been having, over the last several years, actually a couple of decades, a steady shift of freight transport from railways to roads. Okay? That is the result of a grossly distorted tariff structure in the railways, where passenger traffic is hugely subsidized, and that's cross-subsidized by overcharging freight. As a result, of course, freight moves to the roads, which actually have a much worse both energy efficiency and carbon footprint. Okay. Now, the idea that we're going to switch, it's not credible unless the railway tariff structure is also changed, because we can't force people to go to the railways. Now, to change the railway tariff structure, you've got to raise passenger fares. China I think for India is a logical comparator. I mean, China is much richer than India. It's more than twice our per capita income. So if somebody were to say, if you're going to grow at 6% or so per capita, it'll take you 12 years to get to China, where China is now. So it's reasonable to ask, are you fellows going to be in 12 years' time where China is now? Your comparison of the Central Electricity Authority. The real question you ought to ask yourself, do you think these guys will get there in 12 years? Because obviously when you're a much richer country, it won't be the same. But the point really is that there is no willingness at the moment to recognize that in China, if you construct an index of freight tariff versus passenger tariff and compare it with India, the Chinese is 1/5 the Indian. In other words, freight relative to passenger is 1/5 cheaper. So we're clearly running an absurd tariff structure. Now, is that going to change in the railways? And then there's a whole slew of other things that have to change in the railways in order to make the railway transport more efficient. Now, one very good thing that has happened in the new government, I think the new government appointed a committee under Bibek de Broy, who's one of the members of the successor to the Planning Commission. Now, expert committee reports have always existed in India, but the good thing about this one is, first of all, it takes on board virtually everything useful that was said, and I think expands it a little bit. It lays out a phased manner of implementing radical change in the railways, including bringing in all the things the Chinese have done. This report has been put on the web for comments. I'm not sure whether any comments have come, but what I'm told is that they intend to submit it in August. Now, assuming that they don't change the report too much, It's a very good report. The guy's been asked to do it by the Prime Minister himself. So it'll certainly test the government whether you're willing to accept this report or not. Now, if after all this, the report, you don't hear 3 months after the report is submitted that, okay, right, we're going to do, if not all of it, 60% of it, then obviously not much is going to happen. And I think you need to do that in all the components of the energy sector. The energy transport nexus, I think Chuck raised this issue of, is transport a constraint? Absolutely. I mean, there are some key railway lines. Now, the problem there is not the railways. The problem there is those railway lines go through some of our forest areas. And all our NGOs are extremely agitated that this will be hugely disturbing to the peace of all the animals. I believe they worked it out at one point that the trains would travel only during the daytime and not at night. I'm not really sure whether it's such a good idea because many animals are nocturnal. So whether that's a good decision or not, I don't know. But those kinds of things, I think when the midterm appraisal is put forward, presumably some 8 or 9 big decisions should come out. And those decisions will reflect what's feasible, what's not feasible, and so forth.
So
I would say, by the way, that I do think that in India, the recognition that we can't ignore climate change is very much there. In fact, when President Obama was in New Delhi, I think Prime Minister Modi in a joint press conference was asked by one of our press. Our press is always very keen to discern any pressure. So the question asked to Prime Minister Modi was, did President Obama put pressure on you on issues of climate change? To which the Prime Minister said, no, we don't sort of accept any pressure, but climate change is a pressure. And then he went on to make it very plain that he felt that we should do something about it, right? So that's slowly some kind of recognition. Now, if that gets translated into something more concrete, I don't believe that on climate change, India will be lagging far behind the rest. Because the honest truth is not much is happening on climate change. India is not the only one that's lagging behind. Very little is actually being done compared to what is needed.
On that, on your point, I mean, the Prime Minister's written a book called Convenient Action, and he makes a point of letting everyone know that this is in response to Al Gore's book, Inconvenient Truth. So you're absolutely right. I mean, he won't accept pressure, but he has accepted that we have to do something about climate change, and he's mandated his minister to actually draft up a very clear set of guidelines which will lead to the determination of our contribution ahead of COP20. Ahead of Paris at the end of this year.
Can I just very quickly also answer that from the energy access viewpoint, early on in the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, the International Energy Agency did some modeling and found out that in fact, to extend basic energy access to the 1.2 billion people who don't have it today from a climate perspective was really going to be negligible in terms of additional CO2 emissions, even if you were using just conventional solutions today. So I think it was something like 1 or 1.5%, which can be far more than offset using, first of all, the renewables that I was mentioning earlier, but also through energy efficiency as well. So from that standpoint, it's not necessarily such a doom and gloom scenario.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions, it looks like. Why don't we have both of you ask questions and then get a round of answers. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to be sure you both have an opportunity.
Sure. I'm David Cohen. I work at Urban Electric Power. We're a battery manufacturing startup, if you can't tell by my address, actually right around here. But we're doing some work in India. I wanted to know a little bit more about what the electricity costs are and how much they vary between both for the industrial sector versus residential, and by geography. Are businesses making decisions about where to locate based on power availability in a large way? And what sort of, have people quantified the cost of that? And then also, someone mentioned 90 gigawatts of diesel generation, which is as much as the solar that you want to put in. It's a massive amount. And I'm just wondering how much it actually gets used. Have you quantified that?
Let's hold that for a minute and bring in our other question and then get some answers.
Hi there. My name is Andrew Isle. I'm an independent consultant formerly of the U.S. Department of State. I wanted to thank all the panelists for their comments today. Actually, related question on energy pricing, which is one of the barriers that seems to have been recurring throughout this discussion and cuts across all the different energy sources, and of course also plays a big role in energy efficiency. And I wanted to put the question to all the panelists, what you see as the most viable policy prescriptions for overcoming barriers to underpriced energy in India, whether it's removal of explicit subsidies for fossil fuels or addressing surcharges for implicit subsidies like air pollution and carbon or other types of mandates.
Terrific, thank you. So we have both power sector pricing in particular, variation by type and also by place, and then overall on pricing. You want to start with that, Monte?
Well, maybe Vikram can supplement because, you know, some of my information may be out of date. But the short answer is, yes, there's a huge variation. Certainly, for example, in India, industry tends to be overcharged. Households tend to be undercharged. And of course, there's 24%, which is simply leakage, i.e. the system is weak enough that people are getting it at zero. So the range of variation amongst users in the price of electricity is huge. Agriculture in some states is free. I mean, farmers are given, in Punjab, for example, and also I think Andhra Pradesh, they give it free. In other states, it's virtually free and very, very cheap. So I think I wouldn't focus too much on who's doing it free, because virtually everyone is massively underpricing electricity for farmers, which of course is leading to massive problems on the water side, because they're overexploiting the water. I mean, you know, it's a complete mess. Now, does it vary regionally? Yes, it does. But, you know, this pattern, industry high, households low, commercial high, this is quite common. Probably the interstate variation, given this, is not that great. Are people locating depending on electricity? I think they're locating depending on the quality of electricity supply, not just the price. I mean, there's a fantastic debate in Delhi when the last Delhi election took place and the previous chief minister, whom I know quite well, lost the election. The present chief minister had argued that, you know, Delhi consumers are overcharged because right next door in UP, they charge much less. And she was not able to persuade people that the UP electricity supply system is a mess and they are completely unviable, and that's why you have 7 and 8 hour power cuts, whereas in Delhi, you pay a little bit more, but the power is assured. But somehow it wasn't able to convince people because the chief minister said, whatever it is, I'm going to lower the price. And he won with quite a big majority. So, you know, I think the ability of politicians to offer people a freebie, I don't think there's any legal way of stopping it. Unfortunately, I mean, unless you declare it to be a corrupt election practice, I fear that the solution will actually come from a breakdown of the system. And then when people see that, look, this doesn't get you anywhere. But otherwise, definitely businessmen prefer to go to states which have a better power supply situation, which doesn't necessarily mean apparently cheap supply. It just means more regular power. So that's certainly there, in fact.
That's right. It's pricing overall. But I tell you what, we have time for closing comments here. I have a question from Twitter, which I think is a one-word answer, but it's does India have shale? As you offer your closing comments, and maybe a tool just to put you on the spot, maybe we'll just start with you and come down this way for any closing thoughts, and you can pick up the shale oil question, pick up the question on pricing and subsidies overall, or just any final comments you like.
Well, the one-word answer is yes, India does, but quality is not very good. I think overall, my summary comment would be...
I'm sorry, just to jump in, you said yes, shale, but the quality is not very good?
Yes, shale, in terms of shale, you know, resource base, both for oil and gas, more known for gas than for oil, but quality is not very good. I think overall, my summary comment would be, you know, huge potential, We heard about the GDP growth. Energy is critical both for growth, but also for energy poverty and addressing energy for the 300 million people in India who do not have energy. We need some very significant reform. Pricing is critical, and also public-private partnership. Government alone cannot solve the problem. Needs to be partnering with the private sector, both within India and then attracting private sector from outside of India.
Richenda.
So I'll just focus on a different aspect of pricing, which is that one of the challenges for the heavily subsidized cost of residential power is that it's very difficult for small entrepreneurs who are trying to build a new business to compete. So one of the challenges that has come recently has been around tariff setting, and particularly in the microgrid, the mini-grid sector. If those companies have to provide electricity at the same price as the national grid. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, of course, because consumers shouldn't have to pay more depending on where they get their power from. But from the company perspective, when you're a smaller mini-grid company trying to sort of get going and scale, then you just can't compete with a heavily subsidized national grid. So it's a challenge there, which is, if you're trying to help support these mini-grid companies, then you have to look at not limiting the price that they can charge the consumers, but at the same time deal with the constraint that you may be accused of price gouging if you do that.
Vikram Mehta.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a slide on pricing, and I'm just to, if I see these numbers, the average loss for a domestic consumer, so if you sold electricity to a domestic consumer, which accounts for 24% of the total consumption, is 41%. So the generator is actually losing he's pricing it at 41% below his cost of acquisition. For agriculture, it is most of it is actually almost 100% is gone. So there's a huge cost subsidization here. Industry and commercial are actually cost subsidizing agriculture and domestic. So it's just to put.
Are they paying more than here, or is it?
Well, the numbers, actually the numbers are not here, but the numbers that I recollect, and that's in rupees, the maximum I think is 12 rupees a kilowatt hour, which would be 25 cents a kilowatt hour, yeah? 1/5, 20 cents.
Yeah,
20 cents a kilowatt.
but that's very high.
That's very high. No, that's maximum. That's the industry who's really getting, those are literally a small, whereas the average for the consumer is 5.5 to 6.5 rupees a kilowatt hour. And that consumer is the commercial consumer and some of the industry. But the top price that some industry pays, because they can't substitute away from, and look for a cheaper fuel because of structural constraints, is, I'm told, 12 rupees. But that may be just a very small number. On shale, as I said earlier, I think the answer is yes. The U.S. Geological Survey has done actually some work on 5 of our 26 sedimentary basins, and they've identified, according to them, about 100 trillion cubic feet of geological reserves, which are nothing, just to say that there's potential. But the likelihood of us actually commercializing these reserves or these resources is slim because of the above ground factors that I've already talked about. Just the final point I make is that, I've all said and done, I wrote an article last week, and I gave this government, on balance, a positive I was positive about what they've done in 1 year. And the reason I was positive was because they've taken the right step in the direction of renewable energy. Renewable is very much on their agenda. They've unclogged the coal industry again. I'm not talking about the targets. I'm just saying that there's an uptick in production. And if you were to just look at that, I'd say, okay, something to be, rather than just be churlish about what has not happened, rather than just to focus on the unrealistic targets that they've set for themselves. It's good that they have at least moved forward in the right direction. The one area that they have not actually made much progress is in oil and gas.
Mantak Alwal, you have the last word.
Very difficult to have the last one. I just want to make one, raise a point which I may be wrong, but I had some doubts about whether the 90,000 megawatts of captive power is all based on fuel oil and diesel. My suspicion is a lot of it is based on coal, because there's a lot of largish captive power used by many, so it's not diesel-based, it's coal-based. I agree with the central problem on coal. It's been on the agenda for the last 10 years. I mean, we, in the petroleum sector, we moved away from nationalized industry, opened it up to the private sector. Maybe the regulatory structure wasn't too good, et cetera, but certainly brought in the private sector. I think in coal, we've had a completely irrational policy of not actually repealing the Nationalization Act. Yeah. Now, I think the present government has done a little bit more in the sense that captive mining was always allowed. It became controversial because the mines were allocated administratively, and this people felt encouraged sort of, politically connected people from getting mines. The previous government had decided that we must auction these mines. The present government has actually implemented that. They had quite a successful auction, about 204 or something like that, coal mines. So these are now, they have a complete general legal, social consensus that these have been fairly allocated to whoever gets them, whatever the controversies in the past, so that's going to move forward. I think they've also introduced in the law, which hasn't yet been implemented, the possibility to allow private coal mine operators not to be restricted to captive use. Because up to now, you were allowed to do that, but only for captive use. So if you had a surplus of coal, you really couldn't sell it to someone else who needed the coal if you were a private operator. I think they've introduced some provision in the law that enables the government to do it, but they've yet to activate that. So there is definitely movement on the coal front. But my overall point is really that if you want to look at energy, success in energy is not going to be because we do this doubling and trebling of coal. It's going to be because we do much more energy efficiency. And I think Chuck had a point about supercritical and ultra supercritical. I thought that the previous government had actually decided that from the, whatever it is, from the 13th plan onwards, which is from 2017, all new capacity would be supercritical. I mean, the real problem in India is we've got a lot of state government, public sector, old plants. And we make the thing worse by allocating available coal from Coal India, which is underpriced, to these plants. So you've got a lot of new plants which are importing the coal and are basically facing an effective coal price much higher than these old plants. And if economics were allowed to thrive, I mean, all these old plants should be shut down. The amount of water they're using, the amount of land they've got, but how to do that? I mean, they're all state government, public sector plants. Actually, if state governments were to simply privatize existing power plants, you'd see a lot of new technology come into this sector, and that's what we should actually, well, we can hope to see. There's nothing stopping a state government, by the way, from doing that. I mean, it's their property; they can just privatize it.
We're over time, but I can't resist in asking: is there a realistic prospect of that happening?
I would say yes. Actually, I think one of the interesting things about India is that we love controversy. I mean, it's a consumer good, in the sense that if anyone can create a controversy, they will create it. But we only love controversies in the national capital. So you'd never see no press gets terribly excited about anything that happens in state governments other than murder or that sort of stuff. So quite frankly, if you had a chief minister who was persuaded that I'm going to privatize this plant, he could do it tomorrow. And I really feel that one of the unfortunate things in India is that too much of our intellectual capital concentrates around our national capital. I mean, there's no well-known economist who's actually trying to advise a state government. Whereas with the liberalization of major policies, a lot of the governmental things that remain are really in the realm of the state governments. And even the central government can only sort of lecture them. They can't actually do it.
And I think
So
some of those state governments are bigger than all but 20 countries in the General Assembly.
that
I
is
believe
certainly
so,
true.
yeah.
That is certainly true.
This has been a tremendous panel. We could keep going forever. Please give me a big hand. Thank you.